Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another session of CEU on Saturday mornings. Thank you for everybody who's online, and sorry for a late start. I hand over to Reva to tell us about today's session.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another session in short course in clinical epidemiology. So today we'll be looking at data harmonization. We'll be looking at the concepts to critical appraisal to real world implementation. So the overview would be, in the first part of the presentation, I'll give in general principles for data harmonization. Second, we'll appraise a cohort study which has used this principle of data harmonization. And third example would be how to actually implement this in a real world. So let's start off with a case scenario. So you have a patient, Mr. R. He's a 62-year-old man. He owns a small garment shop in Gandhi Road. So he presents with progressive forgetfulness for 2 years. He has some difficulty managing finances, and he continuously repeats questions. And because of all these symptoms, he's unable to run his business anymore. If you look at his background history, he's a hypertensive and a diabetic for about 15 years. He's a chronic smoker also. His smoking history is about 20 pack years. And he's predominantly has a sedentary lifestyle. So his diagnosis is early onset dementia because his age of onset is less than 65 years. And most likely it's an Alzheimer's disease. So his son has some concerns. He's an IT professional. So he asks you, why did my father develop dementia so early? Am I also at risk? Now, to answer these questions, let's look at the study from the Lancet. It was published in the Health Longevity. It's called Risk Factors for Early Onset and Late Onset Dementia, which is a prospective cohort study. This is another infographic from another Lancet paper, which tells you what are the 14 modifiable dementia risk factors as of 2024. So the number actually represents the reduction in the number of cases of dementia if a particular risk factor is eliminated. So in early life, if you have a lower education, you have a higher chance of dementia. In midlife, risk factors are hearing loss, high LDL cholesterol, depression, traumatic brain injury, physical inactivity, diabetes, smoking, hypertension, obesity, and excessive alcohol intake. And in late life, social isolation, air pollution, and visual loss. These are the risk factors. So overall, out of these 14 risk factors, if you eliminate it, there's 45% chance of reducing the incidence of dementia. So where did these 14 dementia risk factors come from? So most of this data came from cohorts looking at late onset cases of dementia. All the studies on early onset dementia have some flaws. Either they had very small sample size or they showed heterogeneous and imprecise results, especially for key factors like hypertension or diabetes. And they did not look at association with non-white racial or ethnic subgroups. And if you look at early onset dementia, they most likely have different biology and risk patterns. And the problem with early onset dementia, it has a major social and economic impact on patients because it affects people in midlife in their prime earning capacity. Now, who gave this cutoff of 65 years? Is it clinical? No, it's actually based on the US historical standard retirement age. So which age actually has a clinical implication? So these are some of the questions which this cohort tried to answer. And they also want to clarify whether the known dementia risk factors truly apply to early onset disease. They wanted to quantify their effects and compare them rigorously with late onset dementia. Now, this study looked at 5 cohorts in UK and the US. Why did they study 5 cohorts? One is to get enough cases of early onset dementia. The prevalence of early onset dementia is very low. And a single cohort will have very few events and low statistical power and will have unstable estimates. The next use is to improve generalizability. So each cohort represents a different population, different age structure, and different socio-demographic profiles. And also to increase the diversity. So prior studies were mostly on white populations, and this study aimed to include different racial ethnic groups. So if you look at it, all the 5 cohorts had different data. And to compare the results, they have done a procedure called data harmonization. So if you look at it, now the modern research, now we have a lot of collaborative research that results in multiple data sets. The variability in how each of the data sets are collected affects your validity. So the practice of combining different data sets to maximize the comparability and compatibility is called data harmonization. Now look at this example. Suppose you and your colleagues are working across 3 hospitals in South India, and all of you have been looking at hypertension in your hospitals. And you want to collaborate and publish the results in a multicentric study from South India. Suppose hospital A has defined blood pressure as 140/90, hospital B has defined blood pressure of 130/80, hospital C is anyone on treatment. So will you believe the pooled estimate of the prevalence? You will have some doubts because each of them have defined hypertension in different cutoffs. So first of all, if you want to pool the data, you must come to a consensus. What is hypertension? What definition are you going to adopt? Are you going to go the traditional route of taking 140/90, which has been adopted by the ESC and the ESH guidelines? Or will you follow the AHA guidelines, which has used BP cutoff of 130/80? Or will you go with an epidemiological perspective that you should take more than 130/80 plus you take medications for hypertension? One strategy is to use 130/80 as a cutoff. Now, the problem with dataset A is because they have studied only 140/90, you cannot recover the data for this 130 to 140 blood pressure cutoff. Dataset B, you can directly use it, and data C, you can include them as hypertensives. Now, the next strategy is to use 140/90 as a definition. Here, dataset A can be directly usable. In patients with belonging to dataset B, you can apply a filter. That is, you only include the data for patients who have a blood pressure of more than 140/90, and dataset C you include as hypertensive. The third strategy is to create harmonized categories. You either classify patients as normal, you can take them as stage 1 hypertension where the blood pressure is 130 to 139, or you can take them as stage 2 where the blood pressure is more than 140. But here you must note that dataset A cannot populate the elevated stage. So if you take the 140/90 definition, your prevalence will be 25%. And if you take the 130/80 definition, your prevalence will increase to 45%. So it does not matter as long as you document your assumptions clearly. You must explicitly state what definition you've chosen, what was the data lost, and what was the bias introduced. So if you look at what data harmonization it involves, it's not just the technical aspect of combining data sets, which itself is very arduous. It also involves a theoretical challenge in reconciling how concepts are understood between different cohorts. And third thing is the most challenging of all is the logistic challenges in dealing with different data partners and stakeholders. Now, if you look at the 3 dimensions for resolution of data, the first is the syntax. That is the data format. So what format is your data in? Is it in the CSV or the JSON or the HTML? The second dimension for resolving heterogeneity is the structure. That is your concept. So how different variables in a data set relate to each other. It can be structured data, like for example, data tables, or it can be unstructured, like raw text and images. And the semantics, that is what is the intended meaning of the word, what a given variable is intended to measure. Sometimes the same terminology does not mean in different data sets are different. For example, if I say young patient, in one data set, it might probably mean 18 to 25 years. In another data set, it might be less than 30. So other than data harmonizing, are there other ways to combine data? So other ways of integrating data is, one is data integration or data linkage. Another method is standardization. Another method is meta-analysis. So if you look at harmonization, all your data sets are similar and you're trying to produce one huge single cohesive ontology. That means all your data is speaking the same language. For example, if you look at COVID-19 research, you can club all the COVID-19 studies which have looked at public health safety measures. Integration is when you link multiply conceptually different data sets into one category. For example, the Periscope Atlas data set, it has linked COVID-19 public health safety measure data as well as death data as well as the GDP together into one big data set. So what is standardization? It can be seen as the most extreme form of harmonization. Here, all the dimensions, that is the structure, syntax, semantics, is made identical and held as a primary reference point. The aim of standardization is to unify data using a single methodology. So people use standardization, they view it differently. Some people say that standardization is a step towards harmonization. But some people say, no, they're two different concepts. Because harmonization does not impose a single methodology, but standardization imposes a single methodology. So standardized data can be harmonized, but harmonized data is not necessarily standardized. Then the last way is meta-analysis. This all of us are comfortable with. It's basically aggregate data meta-analysis. So each book is like an each study, and you only compare the summary statistics. You don't compare the raw data. Another method of data harmonization is mega-analysis. This is also known as individual participant data, where you actually pool the results of individual patients from different studies. So one stage IPD is when you do the analysis on a pooled harmonized data set Two-stage IPD is analysis done on individualized harmonized data set and then it's pooled. Okay, so let's look at the types of implementation of data harmonization. So one is you can retrospectively harmonize the data and you can prospectively harmonize the data. So retrospectively harmonizing means after the data has been collected, you try to parse the data. Prospective is before you start the data collection, you give off a standard operating procedure and protocol to how to collect the data. So which one do you think is more easy? Prospective or retrospective? Yes. So prospective seems to be more easy, but you must understand it has a lot of difficulties. Number one is agreement challenges. Just imagine if three of us are supposed to design protocol, will we all agree on the variable definitions and the concepts? So especially when you're doing across multi-center, people from different health contexts, it's very difficult to agree on consensus. Second thing is institutional resistance. Suppose your hospital already has a data set on a particular study, and asking them to change the methodology is going to have a lot of pushback from your institution. Third thing is practical infeasibility. No one can actually predict what is the future harmonization requirement 10 to 20 years from now on. And third thing is loss of methodological diversity. Just because you repeat identical protocols in multiple studies does not mean it's superior. You will lose the data that you get from using different designs as well as measures. That is why people actually prefer retrospective harmonization. So this is in one direction. And another way to look at it is, are you going to do it stringently or are you going to do it or flexible? So these are basically in orthogonal directions. So you can have a retrospective study which is stringent, or you can have a retrospective study which is flexible. You can have a prospective study which is stringently done, or a prospective study which is flexible. Now, how to implement the data? So there are two important concepts to understand. One is mapping and one is merging. And you merge after you map. So mapping is basically linking variables across data sets based on the meaning. Does this variable in data set A represent the same concept as something in data set B? Merging is once you've finished mapping, you combine the data sets into one. That is, append the data sets into a single file. So let's look at an example. If you have a data set, the variable for systolic blood pressure here is BP underscore sys. In data set 2, it's systolic underscore BP. The first step is to actually identify that both these variables are representing systolic blood pressure. The second is to note the differences. Here you can see that the unit is millimeter mercury, here it's kilopascal. The second thing is, where was this BP measured? Was it measured in the home or was it measured in the clinic? And now you have to design a harmonized concept where you give a new variable name and you must decide what unit you want your harmonized concept to be. So I want it to be in millimeter mercury. Now the next step is merging. So after mapping, you need to convert the units from kilopascals to millimeter mercury, and you have to standardize the variable names. And after doing that, you have to append the data sets into a single file. So this is a merged data set. So first two patients are from cohort A. This was a systolic blood pressure. This is a harmonized variable. And I have classified them as systolic hypertension based on the blood pressure. And I've also given a source note saying this is from the clinic. Now the third and fourth patients are from cohort B. This is their harmonized blood pressure variable. I have classified them as hypertension based on their blood pressure reading. And I have also written in my source note that I have converted this from kilopascal. So it's very important that you document everything. Now, if you do a poor job in mapping, you will have a lot of conceptual error. You'll start having incorrect comparisons. If your merging is poor, you'll have technical errors. You'll have duplicate rows. You might have misaligned rows. So is there any tool that you can actually use for helping you map data? That is, when you have raw data from different cohorts, you'll have different labels, different coding styles. What you can do is you can map them to a standard vocabulary which already exists. So this is called standard medical terminologies. That is, instead of comparing directly variable A to variable A1 to variable B1, you can actually compare them with a standard medical terminology for the concept which represents variable A1 as well as B1. So what are some standard terminologies that we know of? So if you look at disease classification, all of us are familiar with the ICD code, which we use for all our discharge summaries. They also use it for billing and claims as well as classifying mortality data to developed by World Health Organization. Now in America, they use something called current procedural terminology. This is basically codes for all your services and procedures. It's used for billing. For clinical terminology, for example, I have symptoms, patient symptoms, dyspnea, chest pain. You have a systemized nomenclature of medicine called the SNOMED CT. And you have other systems also. And one more thing which you need to know is the LOINC. That is basically for all your lab-specific concepts: logical, observation, identifiers, names, and codes. So you can actually use these existing standard terminologies for you to actually map your data between different data sets. Okay, so now we've talked about harmonizing individual variables. How do you harmonize entire data sets, the structure? So that's why you need this common data model. So these are essential tools for data harmonization. So what they do is they take data from very different sources and they allow institutions to collaborate because they define the syntax and semantics of the data. So because of that, you develop standardized large data repositories. One thing to understand is common data model is not a repository. You're not storing any information in the common data model. It is just like an architecture, like a blueprint, which tells you how to structure your data and standardize it. So it gives you a standardized structure, format, and definitions. It defines tables, variable names, relationships, and it uses standard vocabularies like SNOMED, LOINC, and ICD. Some of the common data models which we use for storing data, mostly if you notice in all our cohort studies, they use something called the OMOP. It's called Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership Common Data Model. This was developed by the OHDSI. Its basic purpose is to harmonize and store all your electronic health record-based patient data. You have other models also, like the Sentinel CDM model, the PICORNet model, the I2B2 model. I'll just show you an example of how, this is an example of the OMOP CDM. So if you see, it gives you a lot of tables. It gives you about 16 tables for standardized clinical data. It gives you some 3 tables for standardized health system, 2 tables for standardized health economics, and it gives you 2 tables for standardized metadata. So what does this all mean? I'll just give you an example. Suppose there's a patient called Lauren, and she's a 36-year-old white. Now she has come to the hospital with endometriosis. She's come to the hospital 6 times with abdominal pain. No one has diagnosed her. On the 6th time, she had a ruptured cyst. That is when she was diagnosed with endometriosis. Now, how will you capture her data? The first here, you can see here, this is the person table. So when you click on it, it gives you a list of variables where you can fill up. So column name, person ID, you can put a value. So the person ID should be an integer, either directly from the source data set or generated as part of the build process. Next is gender concept. For this variable, the concept ID referring to female gender is 8532. Then you enter the year of birth. Then you give the month of birth, the day of birth, and the time. You take it as midnight if you don't know what time the patient was born. Then you have a race concept ID. So the concept ID referring to race is 8527. Ethnicity concept. In US, basically, all the non-Hispanic patients are given this particular ID. And if you don't have the location provider ID or the care set, you just leave it blank. So basically, for a single patient, it tells you how to structure the data into formats. Now, what about her health encounters? So here you can see she has come once to the hospital in 2010, once in 2011, once in 2012. Each of those were single-day hospital visits, and they were all outpatient. And then the final admission was in 2017. Sorry, was in 2013, where she was stayed for more than 7 days. So this also you can capture in this observation period table, where you give them a value for the observation period ID, the person ID. So this links these 2 columns. The person ID here will be the same value in this column. And you can enter the observation period start date and the observation period end date. So this is an example of a common data model. Now you also have common data models for actually data acquisition as well as exchange of data. So here you have 4 models. These are syntactic models. That means they define the structure and format of the data. Very important to know is the health level 7 version 2. This is what most of the hospitals use. Right from when the patient comes for the registration, the entire logistics is actually captured by this data model. And we also have something called the fast healthcare interoperability resources. Okay, so this is about structuring data. And then the last concept in data harmonization is what is centralized architecture and what is federated architecture. So if you look at centralized architecture, this is my central web server, my database. So the institution generates a data and directly gives that data to the centralized database. And this collects data from all the institution, and then it harmonizes the data, and then it analyzes the data. So this is centralized. Federated is sometimes, if you do a multinational cohort, some countries will not want to give away the raw information to the center. So what you do is you protect your own data. You don't give your raw data. What you do is you have your own applications which will harmonize the data based on the common format, and then it sends you the summary statistics to the federated web server. So this web server has no raw data, but it has only the summary statistics which it can use for generating the final result of your multi-cohort studies. So if you want to just put them all in perspective, it's like a library. Data harmonization is looking at harmonizing individual variables. It's like translating all the books into the same language. Common data model is organizing all the books using the same library catalog system and putting them into different shelves. Data federation is, if you want to extract information from a couple of books, it does not allow the books to leave the library. Instead, you must come to the library, search the book, and then go off. So if you look at the steps for data harmonization, the first is preparing. You need to build a team. And you also have to apply for funding. So the amount of funding depends on the number of data sets involved, the necessity of purchasing the data sets, the cost of storing or securing the data set, the length of time and effort projected for harmonizing the data. The next thing is gaining access to data. So this is a function of having financial resources, plus you must also have legal and ethical considerations, including data privacy. And you must decide on retrospective or prospective harmonization. And then you implement the harmonization protocol. And then after you harmonize, you must check the validity of your data. And very important is to produce a documentation on the harmonization process. Now, to achieve successful harmonization, first is a collaborative framework. All the researchers must be ready to share the knowledge and give the time and resources for this entire exercise. Next thing is you have to have expert input. You need to have people from the scientific domain, people who are good at methodology, the harmonization method, ethics and law to minimize bias and to also address the integration issues. You should have valid data input. That means your original data items from individual studies should be of good quality. And you should also have valid data output. The harmonized variables that you have developed should be reproducible and should be of high quality. And you should have rigorous documentation and you must respect all the stakeholders. You have to adhere to ethical and legal requirements. You must protect intellectual property and the rights of participants and investigators. So now let's go back to our study, which we're going to appraise today. It's called Risk Factors for Early Onset and Late Onset Dementia, which is a prospective cohort study. So I'll be applying the CAST checklist. So did the study address a clearly focused issue? So yes. So the population it looked at were adults 24 to 86 years residing in the US and UK belonging to 5 longitudinal cohorts. The exposure was, they looked at various risk factors, demographics like sex, race, ethnicity, education, clinical factors like hypertension, diabetes, obesity, hypercholesterolemia, and depression, and the lifestyle that they have looked at was smoking, alcohol, overconsumption, and physical inactivity. The outcome was incidence of dementia, and they have used a cutoff of 60 years to define early dementia. The follow-up time was around 13.7 years. The study design was a pooled prospective cohort study with retrospective harmonization of multiple cohorts. So was the cohort recruited in an acceptable way? So they have looked at 5 cohorts. The atherosclerosis risk in community, it's called the ARIC study, the Framingham Heart study, the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, and the Whitehall 2 studies. These 4 studies actually belong to a bigger project called the Dementia Risk Prediction Project running in the US, which actually has 16 cohorts. And they've also looked at the UK Biobank cohort. So what is the UK Biobank cohort? This was all the participants recruited in this cohort were from 2006 to 2010. They have gotten about 5 lakh volunteers. These are the sites where the participants were recruited from. So what makes them special is this is the world's most detailed study for tracking long-term health of people as they age. They have a large cohort and they have extensive information on the lifestyle, environment, and the biological factors. And they've been studying them for quite some time. And the data is accessible. One thing I want to point out is the UK Biobank participants have a healthy volunteer bias. On an average, the patients are slightly wealthier and they're more healthy compared to the national population. That's one thing to keep in mind. I looked at another study which actually looked at the cohort validity, and I found that actually volunteer bias in the UK Biobank was substantial. In some cases, so severe that unweighted estimates had the opposite sign of association in the target population. For example, older individuals reported being in better health in the cohort, but if you look at the UK census, they were actually doing worse. And if you actually use some weighting, you will find that sample size is actually equivalent to only 32% of its original size. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that the UK Biobank has a healthy volunteer bias. Now, if you look at the other cohorts, they came from the dementia risk prediction model. So this was actually 16 longitudinal studies. It has participants from more than 49 out of the 50 US states. And they also have participants from France, Iceland, England, and Netherlands. And the baseline examination range was from 1948 to 2006 were included. And the good thing about this is it provides direct access to harmonized individual level data for around 95,000 patients. So if you look, these are all the 16 cohorts which are part of the DRPP project. And the cohort which we have selected for this current study is the ARIC cohort, the Framingham Heart Study cohort, the MESA cohort, and the Whitehall 2 cohort. These are the 4 cohorts which were chosen. They have not given a reason why they chose only these 4 cohorts. Now, the ARIC cohort is basically in the mostly in the US. It has about 15,667 individuals. They were recruited from 87 to 99. I'll come to the Framingham Heart Study. The MESA cohort is also in the US. This has about 6,814 participants. They were recruited from 2000 to 2002. The Whitehall cohort is basically the British military people, and this is being conducted in London, England. They have about 10,000 patients, and this cohort was recruited from 1985 to 1988. I just made a slide using AI to actually put the Framingham Heart Study cohorts in a good perspective. So all of us are aware of Framingham Heart Study, right? This is the largest and the longest cohort in the world. So the original cohort was actually recruited in 1948. This is also called the Generation 1 cohort. Their children were recruited in 1971. This is called the Generation 2 cohort. And their third generation, the grandchildren were recruited in 2002. So this is also called the Gen 3 cohort. They also had 2 other cohorts called the Omni cohort and Omni 2. Because by 1994, they realized that actually that Framingham, which is predominantly white, now has a lot of multiracial population. So they want to include all the other ethnicities, and they created the Omni cohort. Omni 2 is basically the relatives of the Omni 1 cohort. And they have something called new offspring spouse. Basically, the husbands or relative or wives of the Generation 2 cohort, 2 of the children should have been in the Generation 3 cohort. And if so, they were recruited in the new offspring spouse cohort. Okay, so how do they recruit these patients? So the baseline visit for the current study was the first visit where the dementia ascertainment began. So for example, in the ARIC study, the dementia ascertainment began in exam 1, the first visit itself. In MESA also it began in the first visit. In Whitehall, it began in the first visit. In the Framingham Omni cohort also, it began in the first visit. In the original Framingham cohort, they started to look for dementia only in visit 14. So from that time only, patients were recruited. In the other cohort, some were in visit 4, some were in visit 2. So was the cohort recruited in an acceptable way? I would say overall, yes. The only thing is that's a healthy volunteer bias in the UK Biobank. And I'm not sure why only 4 out of the 16 studies in DRPP project were included. They have not given a clear reason to why. Next question is, was the exposure accurately measured to minimize bias? So if you look at it, they looked at various demographic variables, they've looked at clinical variables and lifestyle variables. And they have clearly defined what these variables mean. So these are the harmonized definitions of all the variables. And they've done data harmonization from all the 5 cohorts by using the PS Harmonize R package, and the full details were referenced to the original article. So in their 14th reference, they have actually shown how they have done the harmonization. So in the next few slides, I'll just take you the process of how they've done the harmonization. So the first step is actually to define the research question. You select the studies to draw from, you identify the variables of interest, and then you finalize the units of measurement as well as the common categorical values. Next, you have to develop and execute the code to perform harmonization. So here they've used the PS Harmonize code. Next, you need to assess the quality and disseminate the final data product. So this is the study where they have put their harmonization protocol in. So if you look at it, for the overall study, these are the harmonized variables and the domains in the DRPP project. So you have demographic variables, you have clinical risk factors, and you have outcomes. Okay, so let's look at the harmonization workflow. So the first step is actually to catalog the raw data. You have to record the data set names, all the variable names in all the different data sets, and you have to create a metadata set. This is central to inventory all the data resources. So for example, this is another cohort, the SALSA cohort. This is also part of the DRPP study. So if you look at it, they have different, these are all the variables in the SALSA cohort. This is the data set name of the SALSA cohort. These are the individual variables in the SALSA cohort. And this is the label. They also tell you a row saying where these, from which cohort all these variables came from, and also tell you which visit. So this is absolutely necessary because you need to, if you want to identify all the variables and if you want to actually decide which variables you want to give priority to, you must combine all the variables from all the study into a meta data set. The next step is actually to create harmonization decisions. So to do this, you need to create something called the harmonization sheet. So this is an example of a harmonization sheet. Why is it useful? It serves as a set of instructions and a code to run with a harmonization function. And it also gives you an leeway to actually document all your coding decisions under the notes domain. Here you can see coding notes. Okay, and these coding notes and general notes are included in the harmonization sheet itself and also displayed in the summary report. And it helps you explain and track the decisions. So let's look at one example. Look at the ARIC cohort. These are the visits the patient has come to the ARIC cohort, and this is the height for a particular patient. And you can see that this is the source unit. That means in the original ARIC cohort, all the height was documented in centimeter. Let's look at the Framingham cohort. In Framingham cohort, if you look at it, they have recorded height in inches. So now you need to convert the inches into centimeter. So here you have the code. So for ARIC cohort, there is no need for you to code the data. There's no need for you to execute any function. And in the coding notes, you'll write no change needed. But for the Framingham cohort, you need to give the formula, how to convert the centimeters into inches. You need to tell the software that this is the function that you want to execute. And you also write the note, coding note, saying that you have converted from inches to centimeter. And then you have the final units, and you also have the source unit. Now, what about categorical variables? How do you harmonize them? So if you look at the DRPP cohort, after they spoke to individual investigators, they have decided that they're going to harmonize the education category as no school or grade school. The second category would be high school, and the third category would be technical, vocational, college, graduate, or professional category. If you look at the data, you can see that each of the individual cohorts have their own coding system for education. And you can see that all of them needed to be recoded. So let's look at an example. So ARIC had education categories of, they had given a code of 1 if the patient had finished grade school or 0 years of education. Code 2 if the patient attended high school but did not have a degree. Code 3 is if they attended high school and were graduates. 4, 5, 6 is for college. So now you need to recode 1 as no school. You need to recode 2 and 3 as high school. 4, 5, 6 as this category. So here you can see under the ARIC study, you have the source item and they have given the coding instructions. And they've told the function also, they told to recode the category, and they've also given you the coding notes. So now that you have created this harmonization sheet, the next thing is to send it to the software and ask the software to run the harmonization function. So the software does it, and it gives you the final harmonization sheet, which has a long data set as well as a wide data set. And it gives you the summary also. So for example, this is the final harmonized data sheet for the ARIC study, the education. So it tells you the original code in the ARIC data. It tells you now the new codes in the new harmonized data sheet. And it also gives you now the numbers. So this is the final harmonized data sheet. And also gives you the harmonized weight in the raw, like in the raw data set as well as in the harmonized data set. Here you can see that in the raw data set, you can see there's a lot of variations between the weight because some of them are in kilograms and some of them in pounds. But in the harmonized data set, they have become more or less uniform. So in the DRPP, they have also done something called federation of data. So 14 out of the 16 cohorts actually sent all the data sets to a central server and got it centrally harmonized. 2 of the data sets actually had refused to give that data. So what they did was the central team sent the harmonization package to the external cohorts. They actually sent the harmonized tool itself. They gave an example of the template, the harmonization sheet they had given to the external cohorts. And they had also, how much ever they could harmonize the values, they've completed that and sent it to the external cohorts. And they've also pre-filled the target variable definitions and coding structure. They filled metadata fields like the coding notes and notes. So this is the harmonization sheet which they gave to the external cohorts. So you can see here that the source variable, source value are all left blank. These are all have to be filled by the external cohorts. Now, what is the duty of the external cohort? First of all, they must enter the source data set and variable names as well as the raw values. They must map and provide coding framework in their own centers. Then they enter the documentation column. They run this PS Harmonize tool in their environment. They create their R Markdown report, and then they send that report to the central coordinating team. So here there is no raw data sharing. So this PES Harmonize R package performs data transformations useful in harmonization. All the results and coding instructions are compiled in a harmonization sheet, and it generates a summary R Markdown output. So this harmonization process, so they've done data harmonization. Now, how to assess the validity? You need to have a transparent methodology. So if you look at systematic reviews, we have a methodology called the Prisma checklist. It basically tells you a transparent way of how they did the systematic review. For RCTs, you use something called consort. consort checklist. And for cohort studies, you present data with a Strobe checklist. So is there any checklist for actually presenting data harmonization? Yes. So there is a Maelstrom research guidelines for rigorous retrospective data harmonization. This was actually developed by Dr. Isabelle Fortier as well as Dr. Vincent Ferretti. So they have broken down the entire process of data harmonization into 5 categories. 0 is the pre-phase where you define the research question. 1 is when you assemble the information and select your studies. 2 is you define the variables and evaluate the harmonization potential of each of the variables. 3rd is the processing of the data. 4th is to estimate the quality of the data. And 5th is to disseminate. So if you look at it, the research question was well defined, so I gave it a tick mark. The protocol takes into account questions related to the feasibility. I couldn't really find a protocol, so I have put it as blue. The 3rd question was study-specific information gathered allows understanding the study designs, timeline, population, characteristic, data content, standard operating procedures? Yes. Whether study selected based on explicit selection criteria, I gave it no because that was not mentioned. Then was the data schema variable selected based on the relevance in answering the research question? Yes, they have chosen set clinical criteria and lifestyle variables. 4th thing is, so the next question is, does data schema variables, were they clearly defined? I gave it yes. I showed you a picture also of how they define all the variables. The next is the potential for each study to create the data schema variables is assessed and documented. I could not really find the documentation of this, so I gave it a blue. Next is about data processing. So if the harmonization is possible, was the study-specific items required to generate the data schema variables? Were they made available in the computing infrastructure? So I gave it yes, because they have made all their everything available. The quality also was assessed and considered adequate. The data processing was achieved using appropriate statistical models. They have used the PS Harmonize tool. And harmonized data generated and algorithms or models used to process data are also documented. And they've also looked at quality of the study by doing external validation. And all the harmonized data are available to the approved users. And the information required to understand harmonization procedures are also made accessible. So in that same article, they have given you the lead contact. They've also told you where the data is available. You need to send a request to this particular link. And after sending the access, they will send you the data. So even though they have gone through such a rigorous data harmonization, I still said no for was the exposure accurately measured to minimize bias. Now, why did I say no? They have mentioned clearly that only the risk factor exposures at the baseline visit were used for analysis. So imagine they're following up a patient for more than 14 years. Maybe at the onset, I didn't have diabetes, but maybe by that's year 1 or year 2, I would develop diabetes. So that is not captured in this cohort. So there's only single time point exposure. They have ignored the trajectories, and this may result in misclassification after a long time. So the next question, was the outcome accurately measured to minimize bias? So the problem with our outcome assessment was, in the ARIC and the Framingham Heart studies, they have actually done a clinical assessment. They regularly did a neurological examination on the patients. They did cognitive assessments. They even contacted the patients via telephone. But in the NISA, UK Biobank and Whitehall too, they only used the administrative codes to actually figure out if the patient had dementia or not. So this is just from the study. And these are the ICD codes that they have used to classify dementia in the various types. So because they have used mixed ascertainment methods, we cannot immediately say that there is uniformity in the diagnostic accuracy. Now, the next part is the statistical analysis. So we saw how the harmonized data from all the cohorts were pooled for combined analysis. And what do they do with missing values? So they have done something called multiple imputations. The DRPP cohort, the 4 studies in that, they use the multi-level joint modeling to account for repeated measures. They use the JOMO packet in the R. The UK Biobank has used full conditional modeling for missing data, and they have used a MICE package in R. Now, how do they actually analyze the data? This is the time frame of analysis. So once the patient gets recruited, they follow up the patient from the baseline visit. And then once the patient develops dementia, or the patient has a death, or the patient lost to follow up, or if there is administrative censoring, then you stop following up the patient. But if you want to analyze for early onset dementia, you must censor the follow-up at 65 years if there is no event, irrespective of whether the patient has developed any of the outcomes. And for late onset dementia analysis, your follow-up, your entry point should start at age 65. So based on this, they have calculated crude dementia incidence rates. They have looked at early onset dementia, the late onset dementia incidence. They further stratified it by sex, and they've also used 5-year age groups to look at incidence. And they've also looked at the association of a particular risk factor with either early onset or late onset dementia by using Koch regression model with time varying variables. So age was used as a time scale. And the output was basically a hazard ratio. And they've also done additional set of analysis. So for the Cox regression, they have used the time varying effect at age 65. They have changed it to 60, 70, 75, and 80. They've also investigated dementia subtypes, and they've also done an extensive sensitivity analysis. And for adjustment modeling, they have model 1 was unadjusted. Model 2 was adjusted for demographics like cohort, sex, race, and education. Model 3 was adjusted for all the above plus clinical and lifestyle factors. And all the analysis was done in the R studio. Now, if you look at it, they had an extensive sensitivity analysis, which was like spanning more than 2 pages. I just clubbed them together as into domains. First is to address exposure misclassification. They have separated the medication use from the disease definitions, and then they've analyzed the data. They have used sex-specific alcohol cutoffs. For in the original data set, they have said alcohol overuse is if you consume about 164 grams units of alcohol in a week. But actually, if you look at it, for females, harmful is more than 92, and for males, it's more than 190. Then they've also restricted the follow-up to 10 to 15 years to reduce exposure misclassification. Now, to address confounding, if you notice that they have not looked at genetic risk factors, that is ApoE. So they've taken a surrogate marker by looking at family history of dementia to address genetic causes of dementia. And they've also tested the cohorts by excluding the UK Biobank, because UK Biobank we said was healthy volunteer bias. So they removed that and done a reanalysis. And also for the missing data, they had initially done imputation analysis, right? So they removed all the missing cases and compared only with the complete case records. And for competing risk, they have assessed competing risk of death. And then another interesting thing was the reverse causation. To address this, they have looked at the lag analysis by introducing lag periods of 3 and 10 years. And they've also excluded underweight patients. I just thought I'll just explain the lag analysis and the reverse causation. Now, if you look at this graph, you have BMI on the y-axis and you have time before dementia on the x-axis. So here is where you actually diagnose the patient with dementia. But if you notice something, you can see that the BMI starts to fall, maybe 20 years before the dementia diagnosis. Why is it that? Because preclinical dementia also causes weight loss. Now, suppose I analyze the patient here. I'm doing a study 5 years before the dementia diagnosis. I will suddenly realize that patient with a low BMI develops dementia. So then I will wrongly say low weight causes dementia, when in truth, actually, the early dementia caused the weight loss. So how do you account for this? So normal analysis is you follow up the patient from baseline, and then you see when the patient develops dementia. In lag analysis, from the baseline, you give pre-specify lag period, say about 3 years or 10 years, for example, in this study. And any dementia which falls in that period, you must exclude from your analysis. And then only you start to count the dementia incidence cases after the lag period has lapsed. So if a risk factor is still associated after lagging, that means it's a true causal effect. But if an association disappears after lagging, that means it's a reverse causation. So have the authors identified all important confounding factors? I said no, because one very important confounding factor is the ApoE genotype. This can actually confound hypercholesterolemia, which they have not accounted for. They have indirectly taken family history of dementia instead. And then under SES, they have looked at only education, but they have not looked at income. And another thing they should have considered was, what about the access to healthcare and frequency of medical visit? Because if you frequently visit the medical visit, if you frequently come to the hospital, there's a higher chance that you can actually pick up dementia. And sometimes social engagement also affects the onset of dementia. And also diet also should have been taken into consideration, because that can confound obesity as well as diabetes associations. And they have not looked at sleep duration and sleep disorders like OSA, which can confound with cardiometabolic disorders. So have they taken into account confounding factors in the design? Yes, I had just talked about how they have adjusted for various models and how they have done sensitivity analysis looking at confounders. Was the follow-up of subjects complete and long enough? So here they have not told about any loss to follow-up, but the median follow-up time was about 13.7 years. So we have finished the validity part of the CAS checklist. Now let's look at the results. So what are the results of the study and how precise are the results? So if you look at the analytical sample, 42,000 patients came from the DRPP cohorts, 4 studies, and 5 lakh participants eligible came from the UK Biobank. So almost 92% of the participants actually came from the UK Biobank. Out of it, 236 patients were excluded due to dementia, and at the baseline itself, and 6 were excluded because they didn't have, they had missing race and ethnicity data. And so finally, they had about 5 lakh, around 44,000 cases in the final analytical sample. Now look at the incidence rates. The incidence rates for early dementia was 1.97, late onset dementia was 41.17. And if you stratify by sex, you find that the ratios are higher, the incidence rates are higher for males. In early onset dementia, the incidence rate was 2.34 in male and 1.66 per 10,000 person years in female participants. In late onset dementia also, it was the same. It was more in the male participants and less in the female participants. And the other thing is, if you look at the incidence rate based on the 5-year stratification, you can see that it's doubling. In 50 to 54, it was 0.95. In 55 to 60, it's 1.67. 60 to 64 is 3.68. So this is just a picture which just shows that as you go up every 5 age group, you can see that there's a rise in the incidence of dementia. This is the baseline patient characteristics. So the mean age was around 56.3. It was more, there were more females in this cohort, and most of the cohort was basically whites. If you looked at education, about 58.4% of the patients were post high school. And hypertension is a significant amount of them are hypertensives. The diabetes prevalence was about 5.1%. But if you look at the Indian studies, most of our Indian prevalence is about 10% diabetics. And they also had quite a few people who had high cholesterol levels. And around 10.2% of the population had depression. So this is the results, results for Model 1, Model 2, Model 3. They have given you the associations, the hazard ratios for early onset as well as late onset dementia. And they've also looked at the interaction between these two. Is there anything significant? So the first thing that we notice is gender, there is a significance. Being a female is actually protective. And it's also protective even for early onset dementia. If you look at the race and ethnicity, you can see overall that the blacks had a higher hazard ratios. But did that really affect early onset dementia versus late onset dementia? No. Next is education. If you can see, the reference is a good education. The lower your education, the more chance that you're going to develop dementia. And it's also important across the early onset dementia as well as the late onset dementia. And interestingly, actually, there was no association for hypertension. What about diabetes? Diabetes also was more in the early onset dementia as compared to the late onset dementia. Obesity was also the same. And there was more depression in the early onset dementia as compared to the late onset dementia. And what about alcohol consumption? It was associated more with early onset dementia as compared to late onset dementia. And so was smoking. And interestingly, physical activity didn't really change whether you develop early or a late onset dementia. So this is the same thing where they have put it in as a picture format. So female is protective, and grade school education or less is harmful. And having diabetic also is a higher association with early onset dementia and depression, as well as being a current smoker. So in summary, the risk factors with the strongest association with early onset dementia was smoking, depression, diabetes, and low education status. They had done the sensitivity analysis. Only the significant points I'll mention. After they excluded the UK Biobank, they realized that the estimates for depression versus no depression were actually attenuated. The incidence dropped to 1.2, hazard ratio dropped to 1.24 versus 1.1. And when they did the reverse causation with a 10-year lag period, they realized that the depression was actually attenuated. That means early dementia itself can cause some amount of depression in the participants. Other sensitivity analysis did not change the main findings. One more interesting thing I noted was, as the age cutoff was increased to differentiate early onset dementia versus late onset dementia, actually obesity and overweight became protective. So now, do you believe the results of the study? So I believe the results of the study, but there are some things to keep in mind. Exposure was categorized at baseline. Longitudinal exposure was not taken into account. And many of the cohorts relied on ICD codes for dementia diagnosis. So you could probably have underestimated your dementia. Now let's look at the Bradford Hill criteria to look at causality. So some of the risk factors had a strong association. We saw that the hazard ratio was somewhere between 1.7 to 2.5. Temporality, this was well established. Exposure preceded the outcome. It was a time to even design. It has analogy. There are similar mechanisms seen in cardiovascular disease also. And vascular dementia, it's a very important cause of dementia itself. What about consistency? So it was mostly consistent across multiple cohorts and the sensitivity analysis. And this is highly plausible because vascular risk factors causes cerebrovascular damage. Depression and inactivity also affects your neurodegenerative pathways. So is it coherent? It's consistent with existing dementia literature. It's not very specific because same exposures can cause multiple other problems like stroke, MI, etc. What about biological gradient? So we saw that they have taken categories of hypertension, categories of diabetes, but it was not uniformly demonstrated across all exposures. And is there any experimental evidence? So there are some other RCTs, like for example, the Finnish geriatric RCT, which actually they gave 2-year intervention of strict lifestyle changes, and they realized that the incidence of dementia actually came down. So overall, I would say that there is moderate strength in the Bradford Hill criteria. Now, are the results generalizable? So mostly yes, because the biology of dementia is going to be the same everywhere, and even the epidemiological prevalence. Like India also has a high burden of diabetes, hypertension, it's all on the rise, so it can be applicable. The only thing is we don't know what is the ApoE prevalence in the Indian subcontinent, and is it the same as that in the USA and UK? So do the results of the study fit with other available evidence? Yes. So what are the implications of this study for practice? So this study helps us to identify which modifiable risk factors are the most important for primary prevention efforts. So coming back to a patient, the 62-year-old man who's come with Alzheimer's, like early onset dementia, and the son had 2 questions. Why did my father develop dementia, and am I also at risk? So as a doctor, this was the answer I would give him. So why did my father develop dementia so early? Because his father had multiple modifiable risk factors which are associated with dementia, like diabetes, hypertension, and smoking history. And is the patient at risk? So that depends on his genetics, which has not been captured in this cohort study. It also depends on his modifiable risk factors. So he may have an increased risk, but I would assure him that it's actually modifiable. And what advice will I give the son? So I'll ask him to control the blood sugar levels, the blood pressure levels. I'd advise him avoid smoking, and also to maintain physical and cognitive activity. So just to see if all of you are awake, there is something called data sharing principle. Okay, so basically now we are moving into a scenario where data has to be freely accessible between all the stakeholders. And you have something called the FAIR principles, where data can be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Where do you think data harmonization fits into this? Which of the 4 principles does data harmonization come under? Yes. So it comes under interoperable. So I would be amiss if I don't highlight how data harmonization is being used in the national scale. So I know all of us are familiar with the Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission, right? So it was launched in September 27, 2021. The main goal of this ABDM was to enhance the accessibility and equity of health services through IT and associated technologies. So it's a citizen-centric approach to access both public as well as private healthcare. So the main goal of this ABDM scheme is it has to improve efficiency, effectiveness, and transparency of health services. It grants healthcare professionals better access to patient medical history for enhanced care delivery. So this is where the harmonization principle comes in. So if you look at the ABDM components, it has a ABBA number. ABBA number is basically a 14-digit secure number. It's very simple to create. You can go on the portal and you just enter your Aadhaar card. You'll get an OTP to your phone and you get a new number. Or a patient can come to a hospital center, and then the hospital can help the patient initiate the ABBA number. The next is Health Facility Registry. So this is a repository of all the healthcare facilities in our country, whatever branch of medicine they are. They all have to be registered with the scheme. Next is Healthcare Professionals Registry. So anybody who's practicing either in the private or the public health sector should have a number and should be registered in this repository. Next is Unified Health Interface. So what is it? It's basically a network which links the patient to the healthcare providers. For example, it gives an interface where you can book appointments with the doctor. The doctor can offer teleconsultation services. Next, you have the National Health Claims Exchange, which basically allows all the claims, insurance, and all to be exchanged within the hospital systems. And the last is the PHR, that is the physical health record, where you link your health record by apps. So a patient can download any app on his mobile, and all his health data can be stored in an app. Okay, so if you look at the structure, you have something called health information providers. That can be hospitals, like for example, CMC. We see patients and we record all the data in our server with chips. Or a patient can come to a diagnostic center, and the diagnostic center will maintain the patient database. Patient can go to smaller clinics. And what about the health programs? Government of India has so many health programs, the reproductive, the RCH program. So any patient who's linked to that program will also have data in its own. Okay. Okay, so that's called the health information provider. So all the data from these providers are stored in their own local database called the health repository provider. It can be an EMR or an LMIS system. And who's a health information user? A health information user can be the hospital itself. It can be the diagnostic center or the clinic itself, where you want to actually, if a patient comes to you and you want to retrieve the patient medical data, you'll be called as a health information user. So a hospital can be a health information provider, or hospital can be a health information user. Okay. Okay, so if you look at it, this is a patient, he's a user, and he can go to a hospital, and he has an app called the patient health information app. And if the hospital asks the patient to give consent to view their past history, they can give a consent. And then the request is actually sent to the center. The center is called the Health Information Exchange and Consent Manager. Once it receives the request, it will actually send a message to the health information provider and request for the data, and then it is transferred to the hospital system. So if you look at the IT landscape, you have the building blocks. You have one building block is the digital health registry and profile management, where you have to generate ABA for the patients, the health provider registry, and the health facility registry. You also have to develop the health information exchange consent manager, as well as the web, where the patient can keep a physical copy of his health record. So it's working on bringing the interoperability of digital health data in India. It has 3 milestones. The first milestone is actually to create the patient numbers. The second milestone is to create a repository for the health information provider, and they should be able to share the digital record. And the third milestone is actually for the health information user to provide view of the patient's medical history. So they have 2 apps. They have citizen-facing app, and they also have the health repository app. So the PHR app is basically the patient, they can download an app and they can store all the medical history in that app. For the health repository, you have something called health facilities. You have the HMIS and the LMIS system, and you use it to the FHIR standard. FHIR is a common data model for information transfer. You can also have health lockers, where all the patient's data can be stored in digital clouds. Then the government health programs can be stored in a different application. And you also have digital repositories from the PHR apps. So where does harmonization fit in this? So if you see, they're using something called the common data model. So imagine all these hospitals have their own way of storing data. They must structure all their models into a particular format. And that is where the FHIR model is actually used for the ABDM scheme. So local EMR is mapped to the FHIR format, and then it is sent to the user. And local lab codes are mapped to the LOINC, and the diagnoses are mapped to the SNOMED and the ICD. And the next thing to note is this is a federated data network. There is no central base. If you look at the center, it does not hold any data. It's just exchanging data. The data is actually living in the hospital labs and apps. It only facilitates the data flow. The information user requests data. The consent is provided by the exchange management, and the data is fetched from the health information provider. So ABDM is just an example of a national scale data harmonization system. Prospective harmonization is, from now on, any healthcare system should have the FHIR standards. And we're also making common registries. What is retrospective harmonization? All the EMRs which are already existing now has to be mapped to the FHIR common data model. And you can see that there's multi-level harmonization going on. All the data files are being sent by FHIR JSON or the XML format. The semantics are linked to SNOMED and LOINC. And there is a structure. The FHIR gives a structured resource template for data transfer. The next thing to notice is this is a federated harmonization. It's not a central warehouse. So this is my last slide. It's just an analogy between the multi-cohort research versus the ABDM. Whatever is participant ID in a multi-cohort research is the ABA ID in an ABDM. What is a site registry in a cohort study is the health facility registry. The investigator research registry in the cohort, like a research cohort, is equivalent to a health provider registry. The common data models that we use in research is OMOP, but what they use in ABDM is FHIR. And we are doing something called federated meta-analysis, and they're doing the same thing called Health Information Exchange Consent Manager, but they're not doing analysis, they're only doing data transfer. So this wraps up my talk. We talked about concepts. We've looked at how data harmonization is done in a cohort study, and we've also seen how it's being used in a national level scale. Thank you.